So we have about, 45-ish minutes. I'd like to talk about the war in Iran, the dynamics in the region generally, which are terribly understood. Maybe the growing anger at Israel among a segment of Americans and the simultaneous, though I think only partially related relationship to anti-Semitism. That's a lot to bite off.
Sure, sure. That is a lot, but there's a
Well,
lot.
let's start with the war that's going on. I mean, when you were in the State Department, I'm sure you looked at tons of scenarios, including scenarios that involve the military. And yet, instead of going to war, the Obama administration, let's see, oh, they negotiated a nuclear deal. What changed?
Oh, what changed, I think, was Donald Trump for starters on this, right? A decision to walk away from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal that was signed in 2015, that really it wasn't perfect. It didn't have all the answers, but it actually had Iran's nuclear program as contained as it's been really in the last 25 years, and it was working. Trump unilaterally walks away from it in 2018 with no real alternative. At the time, and what we were told for years by critics of the deal is no, 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 we don't want a war. We just don't like this deal. And supporters of the deal would say, well, the problem is it eventually becomes this deal or war. And here we are, 7 years later, the deal is gone, and we're facing a military conflict.
Ilan, you describe it as a deal. It was a deal. It wasn't a treaty, right? We weren't, there was no way, it was so controversial even at the time, there was no chance of getting Congress to okay it as a treaty.
Right. No, I don't think you could get Congress to okay it as a treaty. And so it wasn't the treaty. It didn't fully bind us. It was a temporary 10-year agreement. You would have had to renew it or change,
Hmm. Hmm.
which was one of the criticisms of it. Uh, but at the end of the day, part of it was, look, I spent a lot of time, as you said, at the Pentagon in those years, gaming out alternative scenarios. And when you compared that pathway of diplomacy versus the pathway of going to military conflict, it always became very obvious that the end states of a military conflict, most of the likely scenarios, were just not good. Not good for us, not good for the Iranians, not good for the region, not good for Israel, really not good for anybody, which is why we opted for negotiated
Hmm.
diplomacy.
And um, I mean, some things have changed in part because of couple years of war. Iran is weaker for sure. I mean, the war takes place after Israel, the United States, and even in some instances the Saudis weakened Iran's proxies all around there. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. Um, so Iran is weaker. It was more tempting, but it's still the end games aren't any different.
Right. And I think, look, I looked at a number of different scenarios for how this ends. We actually, when I was at the Pentagon, this is even going back to 2010. And there were plans on the books for how you deal with this scenario. The Pentagon is the department of what if everything gets messed up, right? So we have scenarios for if things go badly, and that involves with Iran a war, right? And so at the time, we went to the planners and we said, well, what do you do in the aftermath? What we learned from Iraq is if there's no plan for the aftermath, this whole thing could just go sideways. And their response was, well, the civilians will have to figure that out. And our response was, well, no, we have to actually plan for this and look at scenarios. And as we went through months and months of methodically thinking about it, where we ultimately came down is by far the most likely scenario in the aftermath of a war between the US and Iran is the regime is still in place. The Iran is significantly weakened, but also much angrier and more aggressive. Think about Saddam Hussein in the 1990s after the first Gulf War. He was still there. He wasn't the same leader he was before, but at the same time, the US spent the 90s with large numbers of forces in the Middle East, constantly containing him, having no fly zones, perennial conflict, regular instability. Also one of the things that eventually unintended consequences, the large American force presence was one of the motivators and inspirers for Osama bin Laden, right? And so what we kind of concluded from that whole process and thinking it through is that's the most likely scenario. And that still is today by far the most likely scenario. Iran's leadership will still be there. The Islamic Republic will still be there. They'll still be lashing out in the Strait of Hormuz. They'll still be aggressive against various regional partners. We'll just be managing this mess for years to come. And that's really been true since even last June when Israel made the decision and the U.S. made the decision to support an Israeli strike in what was then a smaller conflict.
I don't even I can't get my head around what managing this in the long term means. Um, for some people, it means creating a canal zone around the straits, which is an enormous military operation and a permanent deployment. For others, it is this strategy um, that I think is just plain immoral, but it's um, a strategy of Bibi Netanyahu's, which he calls mowing the lawn, which in effect says we leave, but anytime Iran starts to rebuild, we go back and bomb them again forever. I mean, I don't know, like, what are the end games here? What are the, like, couple possible end games?
Sure. So the most likely one is the one you just described, right? Which is where we're kind of stuck in this world of the Saddam Hussein of the 1990s, right? So we are constantly rotating forces into the region. We're constantly undertaking strikes. We are, or some level of strikes. We're guaranteeing a passageway through the Strait of Hormuz. That's the most likely outcome. There's two others that I look at a lot. One is the good outcome, which is Iran's leadership is replaced with something that's more moderate. I don't expect democracy to break out inside of Iran anytime soon, but there's a world where, okay, let's say Mujtaba Khamenei is killed, or just more different leaders inside Iran take over, and they're not going to be Democrats. They're not going to be suddenly giving the Iranian people their freedom, but maybe they make a cost benefit analysis that, hey, what we've been doing hasn't been working. Maybe it's time to pull back on some of our nuclear and regional aspirations in exchange for sanctions relief. Now, that scenario was a lot more plausible before we started this war, and that's one of
Yes,
the problems, is that Ali Khamenei was 86 years old. He had had prostate cancer multiple times. He wasn't going to be around for that much longer. He would just contained Iran, let him pass away from the scene. There would have been a real debate inside that system. People aren't universal in their views, right? They all,
it's
and
90 million people, many of whom are well educated, and they don't like it. And at the beginning of this isn't what they thought they'd get when they had their revolution against the Shah. So there's a lot of that. Yeah.
exactly. And I don't, it's not like you had gotten to democracy or something like that. But even within the leadership, there was debate and difference.
Hmm.
But instead of doing that, what you ended up with was forcing regime change on them by martyring him under the most extreme conditions possible, fighting for their basic survival. And so what did they do? You choose the hardline guy. You choose those who are going to fight because you're in the middle of a fight. And so really now we have the same problem we had a month ago in terms of their leadership, but instead of an 86-year-old leader, you have a 56-year-old leader. And that's a huge, I think that makes that scenario, unfortunately, much less
Yeah.
likely. The third scenario, and this one for us is the worst scenario in my view, which is total collapse. So, in that case, there's talk of the US supporting groups like Kurdish
Like
separatists.
Kurds. The Turks aren't going to like that.
No, the Turks aren't going to like that. So what do? They'll probably start supporting somebody else, right? You have actually Baluchis on the border with Pakistan who have had a long history of separatism. But Pakistan's not going to like that, so they might start supporting others. You start to see where if things collapse entirely, which I don't think is the most likely scenario, it kind of goes the way of Syria or Iraq. Now, Iran's been around for 2,500 years. It's much more of a unitary state than Syria or Iraq, who were drawn on the map 150 years ago by Europeans. So
Right. There's no Sykes-Picot for the Persians. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think Iran is less likely to go in that scenario, but total collapse would just be a humanitarian disaster, 90 million people, us getting sucked in, the region blaming us. Maybe not the worst outcome for the Israelis, since the Iranians will be too internally distracted to maybe fire missiles at Israel. But outside of that, I think really pretty catastrophic.
Yeah. I want to ask you about, I want to frame the relationship with Israel in a way and get your take on this. I spent about 15 years working in the GCC. So it's a region I know pretty well. And it was my sense that the conflict in that part of the world was Sunni Shia more than everything else. And if you put yourself in Iran's position, they're saying, look, there are big Shia minority populations in Yemen, in the eastern part of Saudi, in all around, and they're being marginalized in terrible ways. We're trying to protect them, and that means we have to arm them. And in order to check the growing power of the Sunni world, we are going to declare that Israel and the United States are the enemies in order to mobilize the Arab street in ways that give them a hard time. My sense is that Israel was a side note. It was a tactic in a bigger fight for them.
Yeah, I think that was the case
Yep,
for before October 7th.
I agree.
Now there's always been this external separate competition, military competition between Israel and Iran that was sub rosa there. The Israelis always viewed Iran as the greatest threat. Iran always viewed Israel as a significant military threat, if not, as you said, the most significant challenger threat. I think after October 7th, the Israeli mentality entirely changes.
Mhm.
And they get much more aggressive in response to, I think, justifiably responding to what was a horrific attack, but then going way too far in that response, right? It's one thing to defend yourself. And, the Israelis, in many ways, if you remember how our country was in the years after 9/11, we had this national trauma, a willingness to do, frankly, and support all kinds of things that a few years down the road, Iraq, global war on terror, people started to look at and realize, wow, well, we just kind of went crazy and these were ultimately bad for us. If you remember, and people have disagreements with a lot of the ways, President Biden, handled especially elements of Gaza. I have disagreements with him having served in that administration. But one thing I do remember and very much agreed with that he said is he went to Israel the week after and he said, don't make the same mistakes we made after 9/11. Don't go jumping into a whole bunch of wars with no plans for what to do. I mean, he didn't say all that. He basically said, don't make the same mistakes after 9/11. But I think that's what he meant. Um, and the Israelis have totally done that,
Yep, they have.
war. And they've triggered this Iranian response and this growing confrontation. And now the whole region, which interestingly, one thing I'll say, I don't know when you were in the GCC, their mentality changed really after 2019. And increasingly, their attitude was let's just get along to get along. Let's focus on our economy. Let's focus on moving ourselves off of oil. Let's invest in the future. And let's focus on that. That's the number one priority for Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. And they're stuck in the middle now between Israel and Iran firing away at each other in all of this. And, it's an unfortunate mess.
But we have reporting that MBS in Saudi is pushing Donald Trump to take the entire Iranian regime.
Yeah. And so this is confusing to me, I'll acknowledge, because on the one hand, he's moved in a different direction. But on the other hand, you do have this reporting. So I think there's got to be some mix. I also think, look, Israel and the US attacked Iran. And that was one thing. And then Iran responded by attacking all the Gulf states. Right now, that's a separate thing. Gulf states were trying to not, many of them were trying to not start this. So now the Gulf state attitude is, well, now we got to finish the job here, guys. But do they really know what finish the job means? Can you actually effectuate that? What does that look like? But for the Gulf states, the worst outcome is precisely the one I started by describing, which is just a much more messy, unstable region
Yep.
on the receiving end of that. So they're trying to say to Trump, well, okay, now we're in this. You got to take Iran down to such a level where they're not capable of doing this. But I don't think that level exists. You know?
I was in that part of the world when President Obama said there's a red line in Syria, and then Assad crossed the red line, and President Obama said, "I've rethought." And right, and the Saudis said to me, "We will never trust America ever again." Well, then they decided they would trust Donald Trump. He's launched this war. I don't know how it ends without them saying, "We will never trust America again."
100% agree. I 100% agree because they were thrown into this. But I think the problem is like pulling back more broadly. What the Saudis and the Emiratis want now, I'm just and the Qataris, I'm just not sure is possible. What the scenario we're facing now is very similar to Iraq and Afghanistan. Thankfully, without ground troops, it's air and naval, where we've set the conditions. Trump set the conditions on day one of overthrowing the regime. Now he's pulled it back and he's saying, just dramatically weaken Iran, right? So for us to win, we either need to have this absolute security over the Gulf or we need to overthrow the regime. For Iran to win, all they have to do is either survive or just be able to disrupt things enough, right? It's just one tanker every once in a while going boom in the Strait of Hormuz, and nobody else will push tankers through. It's just a few missiles getting through and hitting critical infrastructure in the Gulf, and world oil prices go crazy, and the Gulf states cannot just continue to function the way they want to. In that way, it's like Iraq and Afghanistan, in that we won all the battles in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? But all the Taliban or the Sunni insurgency or Vietnam for that matter, all they had to do, the Viet Cong, is
Survive.
melt away into the population and every once in a while cause enough chaos and pain. It's very much a
Yes, Ilan, I want to say that's what George Washington did to the powerful British too, way back in the 1770s. So it's not a new tactic.
100%.
Yeah,
That's a very good point. This is classic. What weaker middling powers do to great powers, and is
yeah.
exactly the kind of wars great powers need to avoid.
So there is this scenario where uh, everybody, for their own interest, agrees to stand down, but Iran and the U.S., I guess, because Trump would want to, start to toll every boat that goes through and says, you pay us a ransom to go through.
Yeah,
I mean, Iran has said, look, it's ours. You tell us we have sovereignty over this piece of water and we're done. And that just means they charge everybody for going through. And I'm sure his answer is, I'll get a piece of the action and we'll call it a day.
yeah. I think that won't be acceptable to people, but there is a world where even if it's something less than that, even if it's the Iranians are like, well, you have to check and radio us in before you put a ship through. Something
Hmm.
even much more modest,
Hmm.
and it sends a signal. We control this thing. We have this, we're going to keep the knife up here, right? We're going to keep kind of the knife hovering above, and we can bring it down whenever we want and stop this. And so I do think that's a very likely to the outcome of this. I see if I'm trying to get this to stop right now, and I think that really Trump should try to get it to stop. The smartest way for him to do that would be to go out publicly and say, we've succeeded. We've dramatically knocked Iran back. We're willing to stop and get the Iranians and get the Israelis to stop. And as long as Iran does not block the strait, rebuild its nuclear program, or attack its partners, or attack our regional partners, we will stop. Will Iran stop immediately? Probably not, but the whole world would come down on the Iranians at that point, including the Chinese and others. Everybody would be interested at that point in stopping it. And I think the international pressure would get to them. So, but in that scenario, like you said, they're going to still maintain a lot of leverage over the strait.
Yeah, and that's not a scenario that the other combatant, Israel, will like.
No, it's
So
not.
there's no guarantee they'll stop.
I think that's true. I do think at the end of the day, and this is important, the US has a lot of leverage over Israel. And Donald
Yeah.
Trump has a lot of leverage over Israel if he chooses to use it. And we need to remember that. And if I think he turns to Netanyahu and says, stop, Netanyahu really has no choice but to stop. Just military leverage, political leverage in terms of how popular he is in Israel. And this is also something that's really important for us to remember. We can talk about the role Israel played in launching this war, but at the end of the day, and it was real, and we should talk about it. It's still important to remember that Bibi Netanyahu wanted this of Joe Biden, wanted this of Barack Obama. This has been a thing he's wanted for a long time, but it is only the president of the United States who ultimately made this decision, right? Ideally, well, by law, it should be with Congress. In this case, he did it without Congress. But it's the president of the United
There's
States.
no question we are the dog in this, not the tail.
Yes.
right? I mean, Israel can want what it wants. The president of the United States takes this country into war because we decide to go to war, or he decides to go to war. I mean, all over the world, all the time, there are powers that hope we beat up their enemies. And Bibi has pushed the United States. He's declared Iran an existential threat to Israel and to the West for as long as he's been in power.
Yeah, but nobody made, and he can keep doing that, but nobody made Donald Trump go to war, other than Donald Trump. That was,
Right. No, he's responsible. And he's responsible. And even when you went, but to go back to your comments about remember what it was like after we were attacked on 9/11, as angry as we were, George Bush went to Congress to get authorization to go fight. So even in the rage of being attacked that horrible way, we abided by our laws, not under this administration and
yeah,
not with this Congress.
the way Donald Trump took us to war still boggles my mind. In the week or two before, experts like me were out there kind of trying to raise the alarm bell. It looks like we're about to go to war. And nobody cared. And JStreet, we're an organization that does a lot of community work, a lot of outreach. And what I was hearing from our people, I was like, we have to come out with louder statements. And what I was hearing from our people who work on the communication side was, yeah, but nobody really cares. Nobody seems engaged. Nobody's responding when we're warning about war with Iran. It's because the president did nothing to set the condition for it, right? He
He
had
gave
a
a State of the Union message and didn't think it was worth talking about a couple days before he pulled the trigger.
right 5 minutes and like a 2 hour speech.
Yeah, nothing.
Yeah, and then to announce it with a in the middle of the night with a ridiculous hat on and an 8 minute taped remarks at 2 in the morning to the American public, it's gonna also hurt his ability to prosecute this war. It already is because no war in my lifetime has ever been so unpopular from the very beginning. If they drag on for a while and people realize it was a mistake, but from
There's
the
a 60-day threshold in the War Powers Act, and I fear we are going to get there. I don't think he's going to get us out by that time. And then Congress is going to be in a really interesting position.
yeah, I mean, if Republicans are willing to actually start holding to account. And you do have some who are starting to say things. You saw this week you had members of the even ranking members or chairs of the Armed Services Committee starting to raise the alarm, especially as there's been talk of putting ground forces, boots on the ground. I'm sure we could talk about those scenarios too. Uh, um, they've started to say things, but at least the history of this Congress in the second Trump presidency, every once in a while, the Republicans will wring their hands of and talk about congressional authority, but ultimately they just roll over to the president every time and
They
say,
have.
we'll have to wait and see if maybe this is the time that they finally stand up. I hope so. I would encourage them to do so. I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, well, there's no, I mean, and then the voters all over the country are saying this on election after election after election. There is no space between Republican and Donald Trump these days. Just none. So you said we could talk about the scenario for boots on the ground, and um, I guess that's worth it. If you've done this war gaming, where do boots go? What is that about? What could that possibly be like?
Sure. So there's a few different scenarios that have been reported out in public of potential options the U.S. is considering. I think one that is, I'll start with the one I don't think is going to happen. Just quickly say this idea of putting boots on the ground in the middle of Iran to take highly enriched uranium out of this facility in Esfahan, where you have this enriched uranium buried deep under.
Yes,
This is a
sounds insane.
the problem is this is not like a smash and grab. Like this is not like taking out bin Laden or Maduro or
They have
something.
to dig down under the mountain they bombed.
Exactly. And then you have to be there for hours. Then you have to transport this very fragile gas in canisters. And so in the middle of the country, hundreds of miles in, even Maduro, Caracas is basically on the water, right? So to do that, you'd have to put so many forces in to just guard a perimeter. Because what do the Iranians do if suddenly there's a big American force landing in the middle of the country? They'll flow forces from all over. So that doesn't seem realistic to me. More realistic is taking some of these islands in the Persian Gulf. The one that is most talked about is Karg Island,
Hmm.
which is um, basically 90% of Iran's oil exports go through Karg. And so if you take Karg Island, which I think we could do, and there's U.S. forces being moved into the region, then you say to the Iranians, okay, now we've got 90% of your oil export capacity, give up. There's no indicator to me that that's what they will do. So far, they have not given up at any step. They've just escalated. The most likely response to that is they will start just launching more at oil infrastructure all over the Middle East.
Well, what kind of casualties are we talking about to take that on?
I
Hundreds?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't want to make a speculation. It could be. My hope is it would be relatively bloodless. People have been talking about it for long enough that you'd expect Iran to be prepared and have dug in, and there are some reports
Mhm.
on that. But I
We don't
honestly,
know.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, but the question also becomes, okay, we take it, and the Iranians don't give up. What do we do with the island? Like, what are we doing with this? We now the U.S. owns an island in the middle of the Persian Gulf. Um, and are you going to keep rotating forces on there? They are vulnerable to all kinds of attacks in the Iranian mainland. It's a
Hmm.
lot easier than going deep into Iran because it's harder for Iran to defend an island than it is a
Hmm.
country.
Hmm.
There's other islands right around the Strait of Hormuz you could potentially take and try to use that to guarantee passage through the strait. That makes sense to me as a potential option, but again, same problem. What do you do? And can you like the thing about closing the strait is it's not as though it's open or closed, right? It's about can you get private sector companies,
Insurance companies to,
insurance
yeah.
companies, exactly, like insurance tankers, can you get these companies comfortable enough to go through? You
Yeah.
might
I mean, Iran is telling the world, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. This body of water is open. It's just not open to the people who are attacking us.
exactly, exactly. Frankly, a good article today I was reading, it's not all that different than what we've done with Iran sanctions. Like, we don't sanction everything. We just sanction enough so no bank wants to do business with Iran. And that
Mhm.
caused huge economic pain for them. They're doing the same thing to us. So I don't know if
Uh,
military action takes care
I,
of that.
on the topic of sanctions, can you explain to me why the President of the United States gave 140 billion in sanctions relief to Iran, and I might add to Russia too. But what I can't, it's mind-boggling.
It's I think it was 14 billion it comes
14, I'm
to.
sorry,
But
14 billion.
look, it's still significant.
Yeah.
And basically he's trying to keep oil prices down while he does this. And Iran has all this oil on, in the water. And so he gave them a waiver saying you can sell this oil to American companies. It's crazy. It's the first time since 1995 that Iran is able to actually sell oil directly to the United States. And it's not by doing a deal on its nuclear program. It's not by restraining any of its behavior. It's by threatening the Strait of Hormuz and closing it. And Trump wants to, and you did mention Russia. And I should say the single biggest geopolitical winner in this whole mess is Russia and Vladimir Putin. Oil prices are up significantly. They're an exporter of oil. Um, all of the military weaponry that was before being sent to Ukraine and the focus on Ukraine, all of that is now going to the Middle East. And in these war games, that I've played in the past, sometimes you have a Russia team, sometimes you don't. If you do have a Russia team, like their job's pretty easy. They would just sort of lean back, be quiet, and enjoy. And that's what's happening right now.
Yeah. Um, and let's take a geographic detour to Lebanon. What is actually going on there, and how does that end?
Yeah. And it's an important.
By the way, I love Beirut. I spent a lot of time working there. Beirut, and I know the world is going to think I'm crazy, but Beirut is Arab Tel Aviv. They're very similar, lovely cities. People enjoy being in them, and this conflict is terrible.
100%. It's a beautiful, it's very kind of international and very dynamic. And it's a real
Fabulous. Yeah.
tragedy, what's happened there. And even, it used to be really people used before 1975, people used to call it the Paris of the Middle East,
Yeah,
right?
it
Um,
is a beautiful, beautiful place
um, Now,
with great people.
yeah, and a large Lebanese American population, by the way,
Mhm.
probably the largest of any Arab population in the United States. In terms of Lebanon, I think it's really important that you brought this up because Iran is driving the news in terms of global implications, geopolitics, but in terms of human suffering and the potential for a real disaster, um, what is happening in Lebanon is actually much more significant if it goes ahead. Now, a little bit of history review, right? Hezbollah controls and has long controlled southern part of Lebanon, right? Going back to Israeli invasions, during the Lebanese civil war that created the backlash was the creation of Hezbollah with Iranian support, Iranian proxy. Um, After October 7th, the next day on October 8th, Hezbollah made the choice to get involved in the war, start firing away at Israel. Ended up not going well for them. It took a while, but in late 2024, Israel conducted major operations against Hezbollah, killed its leader Hassan Nasrallah. Frankly, those operations worked were much more effective and much less damaging to Israel than anybody expected, than the Israelis expected, than the United States expected. It was kind of a good news story. And in the aftermath, you had a Lebanese government take over that was the best Lebanese government we've maybe ever seen, certainly since the Civil War.
Yeah.
Willing to distance itself from Hezbollah, willing to press Hezbollah, and slowly trying to make progress in the aftermath of the ceasefire that was signed in late 2024 and displacing Hezbollah and bringing in Lebanese armed forces. Now, perfect? No, this is a years long process to try to get rid of Hezbollah and to try to weaken it, marginalize it, and put in place something better. But I think they were making meaningful progress and the right kind of noises. And unfortunately, not good enough, not fast enough for this Israeli government, who is, I think, again, too short-sighted and just looking at, every nail is, if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. That's kind of where they're at. And it's still that post-October mentality, plus a very hard right-wing Israeli government. And so throughout, the Israeli government is using too much military force to undermine the possibility of this new government. And then after this war starts, Hezbollah jumps in and fires missiles at Israel. Now Israel has announced, basically pushed 1 million people, told them to leave areas of southern Lebanon, and is talking about a major invasion that would go miles in, almost to Beirut. Um, that has not happened yet. The beginnings of it have happened, but if it does happen, the level of killing and death and destruction you will see and the damage to Israel too, not just to Lebanon, I think will be much more significant than what you're even seeing with this fight with Iran. And
Well, I mean, the images Americans have in their head, and it's contributed to a great deal of anger at Israel, is Gaza.
yeah,
And if the plan is to do to southern Lebanon what they did to Gaza, the world, I think, will not put up with it.
100%. And you have these Israeli defense minister and Israeli, hardliners like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, but not just them. The minister, Israel Katz, referencing Gaza and saying Gaza worked, and this is what we need to do in southern Lebanon. And this is what absolutely needs to be avoided in southern Lebanon. I think it would be a human catastrophe and a catastrophe for Israel. If you thought its global image wasn't so tarnished and isolated already, this just would take it to the next level. So um, my hope is that this war with Iran ends soon, and when it does, Trump also restrains Netanyahu to not go into Lebanon. But I have no faith that will necessarily happen.
We have about 7, 8 minutes left. And I think I probably did a disservice to people who are listening by not starting with, could you explain what J Street is, what APAC is, what the relationship is? Because APAC is known in elections, presumably in Democratic primaries, and not happily these days. So just talk about these organizations and what they do and what you do.
Sure. So J Street, we were started, 18 years ago now. We're just turning 18. And we were started precisely to counter APAC because our opinion and our view is that the overwhelming majority of the American Jewish community believes that you can both support Israel and want Israel to thrive as a Jewish democratic state. And the way to do that is not to give the Israeli government a blank check. Because in a very important part of this, if you're going to have an Israel that really reflects Jewish values, is also giving Palestinians freedom and a state of their own and ensuring their security as well. And so J Street has become the voice for American Jews to make this counter argument, as opposed to APAC, who has just been endorsed the Israeli government no matter the policy, no matter what. And so we've gotten very involved in supporting candidates. We now endorse more Democratic candidates than APAC does. We endorse more than half of the Democratic candidates in the House. We endorse 75% of Democratic sitting senators. We were very involved for your viewers in a race just now with Daniel Biss, who is very likely to be the next congressman from Illinois 9 in the outskirts of Chicago. And we worked really closely with Daniel. Our position is, we still think there is a way to be supportive of Israel, but there's a way to be supportive of Israel that does not hurt Palestinians. There's a way to, and I said this, I also worked on the presidential campaign and in 2024. And what I heard from so many, the loudest voices were either, in the aftermath of October 7th, were either support Bibi Netanyahu no matter what, coming from the right, and people who were protesting against Israel on October 8th, when any country would have to justifiably respond. But the overwhelming majority, I think, of American Jews, and I would argue American voters, certainly in the Democratic Party, are in neither of those two extremes. They sit in this place of nuance where you can both support and embrace Israelis and Palestinians. And that is where we sit. And that is the kind of message we're trying to promote through our work. So we're actually very involved in Chicago. We have great leaders in chapter there. And so if any of your listeners, if that is a thing that is of interest, there are ways to find out. Go to our website, reach out to our people. We're going to continue to try to create this place. And frankly, in a world where APAC is playing in these very dirty politics and is increasingly finding itself marginalized, this has been a huge opportunity for us. And we don't necessarily compete with them in the same level of money that they're able to throw into campaigns, because that's not how we roll. But we are where most voters are. And that's, in our view, much more important and valuable and politically powerful than throwing, millions of dollars to play in primaries.
Is there a scenario where the pro-Israel political PACs just divide, and we say, well, there's one for the Republicans, and that's AIPAC, and there's one for the Democrats, it's you, which I think would be very dangerous, but it sure does feel like that schism is coming, and maybe it's coming because the political leadership of Israel chose a political party in the US.
I think that a political leadership of Israel did choose a political party in the US. And look, I will
Very
say,
dangerous.
when we started, I wasn't around. I've only been at J Street for about a year. But when we started, we had people like James Baker, former Secretary of State for George Bush, speaking at our convention, right? This didn't used to be such a partisan issue. It's become more of a partisan issue in recent years because of Bibi Netanyahu. I do think, though, there's now a very interesting debate starting to happen on the right about kind of this blank check support for Israel. You're seeing it in you're seeing it in some cases. It's pretty disturbing and coming from problematic places, from the Tucker Carlsons of the world, where there's a sort of a hinge and a lace of anti-Semitism to it that I think we find very disturbing. But there's also very legitimate debate amongst people who just want to see a more America that is more pulled back on the right and not as interventionist. Like, why is this relationship the way it is? And I think in the aftermath of this war, in many ways, this Obama supporting the nuclear deal and Netanyahu going very publicly against him is really what broke the consensus on Israel inside the Democratic Party. that you need to support the Israeli government no matter what. I think that this war is going to break the consensus inside the Republican Party over time, and so there'll be real healthy debates, and that's all we want. I want Israel to be treated like a normal country, an ally, a partner. They're valuable. On many things, we should work with them. Incredible technology, incredible partnership. I love the country. I love visiting. I grew up there. I lived there till I was 8. Um, and I don't think it deserves exceptional treatment that we don't give to even countries like the UK and France and Japan, who, when we disagree with them, we just don't work together on stuff. We don't give them weapons to do things we disagree with. Like, you can have that just normal
Yeah,
relationship.
yeah, yeah. That would be healthy for